Chapter 1 The night everything died. The cherry blossoms fell like snow over Ko Academy the evening Issei Hayata learned that loyalty was a lie. He had been standing at the edge of the Gremory estate garden, his school jacket draped over one arm, waiting for Rias. She had asked him to meet her there. Said it was important. Said she had something wonderful to share. Those had been her exact words, delivered with a smile so radiant it had made his heart stutter in that embarrassing way it always did. He had arrived early. That was simply who he was. A boy who showed up early, who trained harder than anyone expected, who bled into the stone floors of the Occult Research Club basement without a single complaint. 3 years of loyal service. 3 years of dying and coming back and dying again in her name. He arrived early and he heard everything. The voices drifted from the open window of the western sitting room, carried by the warm evening air along with the scent of roses and something else, something that would later remind him of smoke. Rias spoke first. Her voice was calm in the way that a closed door is calm. Sealed. Deliberate. Riser will be arriving next week. The formal arrangements have been finalized. And Issei? That was Kenneo. Issei recognized her voice instantly. The gentle lilt of it, the slight musical quality that she always carried, even in serious moments. Issei has served his purpose. Rias again. Simple words. Clean. Like she was discussing the disposal of an old training dummy. The boosted gear has stabilized sufficiently. He no longer needs to be the primary focus of our development resources. He will not take this well. Kenneo this time. Flat and quiet as always. He doesn't need to take it anyway at all. There was the soft sound of a teacup being set down. We will reassign his training schedule. Limit his access to the inner circle. He'll understand eventually that his role was always temporary. A stepping stone. It would be cruel to pretend otherwise. Issei stood very still in the garden. The cherry blossoms continued their slow descent. One landed on his shoulder, and he watched it rest there, pink and weightless, before it slid down the fabric of his jacket and vanished into the grass. He had been a stepping stone. He turned the phrase over in his mind with the careful attention of someone who had found a coin they did not recognize, examining it from every angle before accepting that it was real and it was worthless. He had died for her. Technically. He had been killed by Yuma, had bled out on a park bench with the sky going dark above him, had surrendered his soul and his humanity, and his ordinary life on the altar of her red hair and her casual assumption that he would be grateful. He had been grateful. He had trained every morning before sunrise. He had thrown himself against enemies twice his size and 10 times his power with nothing but a dragon screaming inside his chest and a stubborn refusal to fall. A stepping stone. He breathed in slowly through his nose. He breathed out through his mouth. The garden was very quiet except for the wind. What about his feelings for you? Keneo's voice again. And there was something in it this time, something pressed down tight but present, like a bruise. Rias's answer came without hesitation. Issei's feelings are his own responsibility. I never encouraged them. Whatever he imagined was imagined by him. He turned and walked away from the window. He did not run. He had no particular desire to run. His feet found the garden path and carried him through the gate and out onto the street beyond, and the city lights blurred slightly because of the wind, definitely because of the wind, and he walked until he found himself standing on the pedestrian bridge over the river, watching the black water move below. Issei Hayata leaned his forearms on the railing and looked at his hands. The red gauntlet was gone. The boosted gear rested somewhere inside him, dormant, a vast warm presence like an ember bank deep in a fireplace. He could feel the dragon even now. Partner, Drake said, and his voice was quieter than usual. The great dragon who had lived through civilizations, who had clashed with the vanishing dragon across centuries of legend, spoke gently inside his chest. Are you all right? Not even a little bit, Issei said out loud, because there was no one to hear him. But I will be. He was not sure if that was true yet. But he said it again, quietly, like a decision. I will be. The water moved below. The city hummed around him. And somewhere in the deep center of Issei Hayata, where the boosted gear waited like a sleeping star, something began, very slowly, to change. Chapter 2: The Weight of 3 Years. He did not sleep that night. He lay on his back in his bedroom and stared at the ceiling and thought about every single moment he could remember from the past 3 years. He sorted through them the way you sort through a drawer you have ignored for too long, holding each item up to the light, seeing it clearly for perhaps the first time. The day Rias had reincarnated him. He had woken confused and shaking, the memory of dying still fresh and raw, and she had explained calmly what he was now and what she expected, and he had thought she was beautiful and powerful and that being part of her peerage was perhaps the greatest thing that had ever happened to him. The first time the boosted gear had activated in earnest. His arm had erupted in red light and power had surged through him like electricity, and Rias had smiled, and he had felt proud, the way a dog feels proud when it performs correctly for its owner. He winced at that thought now. He had not framed it that way at the time. Training with Kiba. The boy was elegant and precise with a blade, and he had been genuinely kind in that reserved way he had. Issei had respected him. He wondered, lying on his ceiling staring vigil, whether Kiba had known. Whether any of them had. He thought about Asia. Sweet, gentle Asia Argento, the former nun with healing light in her hands and complete sincerity in her eyes. She had come into his life like a small warm lamp being set in a dark room. She cried easily and laughed easily and believed in the goodness of people with a thoroughness that was almost alarming. He thought about Zinovia, who had arrived like a cathedral door being kicked open, all righteous energy and disarming directness. She had once asked him, with the matter-of-fact logic of someone accustomed to absolute clarity of purpose, whether he intended to remain loyal to the Gremory house. He had said yes without hesitation. He thought about Rosweiss, who carried textbooks to battle and apologized for blasting opponents through walls and who had once, in a moment of unguarded honesty, told him that she envied his ability to care about people without calculating the cost first. None of them had come to warn him. That thought sat in him quietly. He did not want to be angry at them. He understood, in the logical part of himself that kept functioning even when the rest of him hurt, that they had their own loyalties, their own positions to protect, their own complicated reasons for silence. He understood it. He still felt it. Around 3 in the morning his dragon stirred. You are thinking in circles, Drake observed. You have been thinking in circles for approximately 4 hours. Thank you for the update. You are also not as invisible as you believe. Your emotions are loud, partner. Even through sacred gear, even through sleep. You are louder than you know. Issei turned onto his side and looked at the wall. What do I do? That, Drake said slowly, with the particular gravity of a being who had existed longer than most human civilizations, is the first genuinely interesting question you have asked tonight. So helpful. You have always had the power. The boosted gear is not hers. It is not theirs. It belongs to you and to me and to the long line of those who carried us before you. You submitted it to her service willingly. You may withdraw it just as willingly. A pause that felt like a door held open. The question is not whether you can choose differently. The question is what you are choosing toward. Issei was quiet for a long moment. The city was quieter now, late enough that even the owls had gone still. Towards something real, he said finally. Something that isn't a role I was cast in without being told. That is a start, Drake said, and there was something in the great dragon's voice that Issei could only describe as warmth. Rest now. Tomorrow you will need to be clear-headed. Why? Because change, Drake said simply, requires presence of mind. Issei closed his eyes. He did not expect to sleep. He fell asleep within minutes, and dreamed of open sky. Chapter 3: The morning after the world ends. He went to school. This was not a dramatic choice. It was simply the next thing, the ordinary next thing, and Issei had learned from his years of devil work that the best way to handle catastrophic internal events was to let the small rituals of the day proceed without interference. Brush teeth. Eat breakfast. Walk to school. Let the familiar rhythm carry him until he had enough ground under his feet to think straight. Co-Academy in the morning had the particular quality of a photograph that has not yet decided what it is a picture of. Students in their uniforms moved along the paths between buildings, talking about homework and weekend plans and a movie someone had seen. The sky was a mild blue. Everything was completely ordinary, and Issei walked through it feeling like a piece of furniture that had been moved 3 inches to the left of where it had always stood. He sat in his seat in class. He answered when called on. He ate his lunch on the roof by himself, which was unusual enough that Matsuda and Motohama had exchanged a look and left him alone, which he appreciated more than he could have said. He was halfway through his rice when he heard footsteps on the stairwell. Asia appeared at the rooftop door, slightly breathless, her blonde hair catching the noon light. She was holding her own lunch and looking at him with an expression that combined concern, guilt, and determination in approximately equal measure. "I wanted to find you," she said. "You found me," Issei said. She came and sat beside him, arranging herself neatly on the concrete edge, opening her lunch box with careful movements. For a moment neither of them spoke. A crow landed on the railing nearby and regarded them both with the ancient judgment of crows. "I didn't know," Asia said. Her voice was small and careful, the way you carry something fragile across an uneven floor. "I didn't know she was going to. I heard this morning. Kaneko told me." She looked at her hands. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. That I wasn't there. It wasn't your job to warn me. It wasn't my job not to either." She looked up at him then, and her eyes were bright in that particular way that meant she was choosing not to cry. "You have always been kind to me, Issei. From the very first day. When everyone else saw a fallen nun, you just saw a person." She took a breath. "Whatever happens with the club, whatever changes, I want you to know that I choose to be your friend. Not because of peerage. Just because of you." Issei looked at her for a long moment. This small sincere person who prayed before every meal and cried during sad movies and had once, with complete seriousness, asked him to explain what a punchline was. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it in a way that required no additional words. They ate their lunches side by side while the crow watched, and for those 20 minutes the world was not so badly arranged. After school he stayed in the classroom after everyone else had filed out. He sat at his desk and took a blank piece of paper from his notebook and a pen from his bag. He drew a line down the center of the page. On the left side he wrote what I have. On the right side he wrote what I need. He sat with the pen hovering for a moment, then began. Left side. The boosted gear and drag. His own growing strength. His knowledge of Devil Society, its rules, its pressure points, its geography. 3 years of combat training that had made him considerably more capable than anyone who had known him before his death would have predicted. His friends, or some of them. His house. His parents, who were entirely unaware of any of this, and who he intended to keep it that way. Right side. Independence. A faction of his own, or at minimum a position that was not conditional on someone else's assessment of his continued usefulness. Allies who had chosen him specifically, not the peerage slot he occupied. Time to figure out what he actually wanted, now that what he had been wanting toward for 3 years had been clarified as a strategy rather than a mutual feeling. He looked at the 2 columns for a long time. The right side was not shorter than the left side. That, he thought, was actually encouraging. Chapter 4 read before dawn. He submitted his formal withdrawal from the Gremory peerage 3 days later. The paperwork was not widely known to exist. Most low-ranking devils were never aware that a reincarnated piece could request release under specific circumstances, primarily because the process was deliberately obscure and the few who attempted it rarely had adequate grounds. Issei had spent 2 evenings in the school library with the older texts that Rias kept in the Occult Research Club storeroom, ones she had never thought to restrict access to because she had never imagined he would look. The grounds he cited were technical but solid. A reincarnated piece who could demonstrate that their king had represented the terms of service in materially false ways retained the right of severance. The conversation he had overheard was not admissible as formal testimony, but what was admissible was the record of missions assigned to him classified as expendable, the training assessments that had consistently understated his growth to keep his ranking artificially low, and 3 instances where his contributions to raiding game preparations had been attributed in official records to other peerage members. Drake had, it turned out, an excellent memory. A perfect memory, in fact. And Devil official records were stored in a system that, once accessed with the proper credentials, was not difficult to read if you knew what you were looking for. He submitted the withdrawal request to the Devil Tribunal through a neutral intermediary. The intermediary was Sona Citri, who had looked at the documentation. He brought her across the desk of the Student Council office with an expression of someone being shown something both entirely unexpected and completely professionally comprehensible. "You have done your research," she said. "Yes. This will create significant disruption." "I imagine it will." She was quiet for a moment, reading through the papers again with the focused precision she brought to everything. Issei waited. He had always had a quiet respect for Sona Citri, for the particular quality of her intelligence, which was not flashy or dramatic but moved through problems like water through stone, patient and thorough and utterly certain of its eventual outcome. "I will file this," she said finally. "As a member of the Tribunal's Youth Advisory Board, I am required to treat formal submissions with neutrality." She set the papers down and looked at him over the rim of her glasses. "And as someone who values precision and fair dealing, I will note that everything in this document appears to be in order." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Follow the process and let the documentation speak." She paused. "Hayadu." "Yes. The boosted gear is a Longinus. A sacred gear of that classification does not lose its rating because of a transfer of peerage affiliation." Another pause. "I want you to know that fact is noted in the record as well." He understood what she was saying. Whatever pressure came, whatever reframing Rias's people might attempt, his value was not diminished by the act of reclaiming his own agency. The boosted gear was what it was, and what it was did not belong to anyone but him. "I understand," he said. He walked out of the Student Council office into the corridor, and the afternoon light came through the tall windows in long golden rectangles, and he stood in one of them for a moment and felt, for the first time in 3 days, something that was not quite peace but was at least pointing in that direction. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. He opened it. The message read, "I heard what happened. I think you made the right choice. We should talk." Below the text was a name he had not expected. Ireina Shido. He stared at the message for a long moment. Ireina. His childhood friend who had returned from her years away as a church warrior, and who had always looked at him with an expression that was slightly too complicated to be simple friendship and slightly too warm to be professional. He typed back when and where. The response came in under 30 seconds. "Tomorrow. Coffee shop near the station. 4 p.m. And don't look so surprised. I always knew you were more than a stepping stone." Some of us were paying attention. He read the last sentence twice. Some of us were paying attention. He put his phone in his pocket and walked toward the school exit, and the evening was beginning its slow golden work on the city, and the world, which had looked very dark 3 days ago on a pedestrian bridge over a black river, looked slightly different now. Not fixed. Not resolved. But different, in the way that a horizon looks different when you have turned to face it. Chapter 5: Coffee, Childhood, and Honest Things. The coffee shop was small and warm and smelled of ground beans and something sweet and baked. It had the particular atmosphere of a place that understood it was not fashionable but had decided not to mind. Ireina Shido was already there when he arrived, sitting at a corner table with her brown hair down from its usual twin tails, wearing a cream-colored cardigan over a pale blue dress. She looked, he thought, like a painting of someone being genuinely comfortable, which was unusual because Ireina in his experience generally looked like someone trying very hard to be appropriately energetic. She waved when she saw him. A real wave, the kind that uses the whole hand. He sat across from her. A server came and he ordered coffee. Ireina was already halfway through something that involved whipped cream. "You look terrible," she said, with the cheerful frankness of a person who has known someone since they were both small enough to chase cats together. "Thank you. You look well." "I am well." She tilted her head. "Are you getting there?" She nodded, and the comfortable candor in her eyes did not push further. That was one of the things about Ireina. She knew when a question had been answered as completely as it was going to be answered, and she moved on without making the other person feel interrogated for it. "How did you find out?" he asked. "The Angel Network is more connected to Devil social circles than either side officially acknowledges," she said. "And I have a friend on the tribunal staff." "Nothing confidential," just the filing itself was noted. She wrapped both hands around her cup. I also heard about it 3 months ago. He blinked. What? The tribunal filing was this week. The conversation in the garden was 3 days ago. But the decision to categorize you as temporary was made months ago, Issei. Her voice was gentle but very direct. I wanted to tell you. I argued with myself about it. I told myself it wasn't my place, that I didn't have confirmation, that maybe I was misunderstanding what I'd been told. She looked at him steadily. I was convincing myself because I was afraid of how complicated it would be. And I'm sorry for that. Issei looked at her. At this girl he had known when she was still young enough to scrape her knees chasing stray animals down back alleys and tell him with absolute certainty that they were going to be heroes when they grew up. I appreciate you saying that, he said. Really? You're not angry? I'm not angry. But I'm also smart enough to know that anger at the wrong person is just waste. He picked up his coffee. Tell me what you know. All of it, she told him. She spoke for nearly 40 minutes, quietly and carefully, covering what she had heard through church intelligence channels about the Gremory political situation, about Riser Phoenix's renewed interest after the cancelled engagement, about the pressure from the Gremory household to stabilize the peerage around a more politically advantageous configuration. She told him about the discussions she was aware of regarding his boosted gear and its potential being considered a liability by some advisors because a piece with a Longinus might eventually outgrow their king's ability to manage them. That last part landed with particular clarity. They were afraid of what I was becoming, he said. Some of them, yes? Ireina nodded. Not of you specifically, or not only that. Of the political situation a free agent Longinus wielder would create. It is easier to keep you close and manage than to have you unaffiliated and growing independently. And now I'm unaffiliated and growing independently. Yes. Something moved through her expression. Which is exactly what you should be. He looked at her. The afternoon light came through the window beside their table and caught the warm brown of her hair and the earnest steadiness in her eyes. Ireina had always been like this, he thought. Underneath all the enthusiasm and the religious conviction and the cheerful noise, there had always been this core of genuinely solid honesty. Can I ask you something? He said. Always. Why did you message me? Not just to apologize. The real reason? She was quiet for a moment. Her hands turned her cup slowly on the table. Because I have been watching you, she said at last, for 3 years. Put everything you had into a situation that was not giving you back what you deserved. And I have been standing on the side telling myself it wasn't my business. She looked up. It is my business. You are my business. You were my business when we were 7 and you were my business when we were enemies for 20 minutes at one time and you are my business now. That is simply how it is. The coffee shop was warm around them. The afternoon was golden through the window. Issei Hayadu, who had spent 3 days cataloging his losses, looked at this girl across the small table and thought, quietly, that not everything he was counting should go on the loss column. Thank you, he said. For paying attention. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that had nothing complicated in it at all. That, she said, is what I do. Chapter 6 What the Dragon Remembers. 3 weeks after the withdrawal was filed, the response came from the tribunal. The formal review had been conducted. The documentation was considered sufficient. The severance was approved, effective immediately, with a 2-week transitional period during which Issei Hayadu would be classified as an independent devil, a designation that carried certain rights and certain complications in equal measure. He read the official letter in his bedroom at 11 o'clock at night with Drake rumbling quietly in the background like distant thunder. So it's official, he said. It has always been official, Drake said, with the patience of great age. The paperwork merely made it visible to others. What happens now? Now, Drake said, you choose what you are building. Issei set the letter down on his desk and looked out his window. The neighborhood was quiet, all ordinary houses with their ordinary lights, and above them the sky was doing what it always did, proceeding with its ancient program of stars and nothing and the suggestion of depth beyond measurement. He thought about what he was building. For the first time in 3 years, the answer to that question was genuinely his to decide. Not shaped by someone else's political calculations. not determined by which training schedule was optimal for a king who was, apparently, managing her pieces like resources on a board. His to decide. He pulled out a notebook. Not the one he used for school. A different one, newer, that he had bought that morning. He opened it to the first page and wrote what I actually want. He sat with the pen for a while. Not because the answer was unclear, but because he wanted to get it right, to say it in words that would hold up when he read them again later. Then he wrote. He wrote that he wanted to be genuinely strong, not strategically managed strong. That he wanted to develop the boosted gear to its actual potential without anyone deciding that potential was inconveniently large. That he wanted friendships that did not have terms and conditions embedded in them, relationships where his value was not conditional on his usefulness within a specific political framework. He wrote that he wanted people around him who had chosen him specifically. Not his power. Not his peerage slot. Not the symbolic significance of a Longinus in their corner. Him. He wrote that he wanted, eventually, to build something. He did not know yet what shape it would take. He knew it would involve protection, because that impulse was built into him at a level deeper than strategy. The absolute baseline commitment to standing between harm and people who could not stand against it themselves. Beyond that, the shape was unclear, and he was willing to let it be unclear for now. He closed the notebook and looked at his hands. Drake, he said. Yes. Tell me about the previous wielders. The ones who actually reached their potential. A long pause. When Drake spoke again, the quality of his voice had shifted, deepened in a way that Issei associated with the dragon accessing parts of himself that were very old and very carefully preserved. There were few, Drake said. Most were soldiers of one kind or another. Most were defined by conflict and ended in it. But there were several who chose differently. Who decided that the power of the boosted gear was not a weapon to be employed but a foundation to be built upon. Another pause. They were the ones I remember most clearly. The ones whose names lasted. What made them different? They understood that the boosted gear amplifies what is already present. Not only strength. Anything. Determination. Care. Commitment. The dragon's power is not a hammer. It is a mirror and a multiplier. It makes more of whatever you bring to it. Drake's voice settled into something quieter. Those wielders brought more than rage to me. They brought purpose. And what they built lasted. Issei sat with that for a long time. Purpose. He was beginning to feel the shape of his own, like a coastline emerging from fog, not yet fully visible but clearly present, clearly real. He picked up the notebook again and wrote one more line. Not revenge. Transcendence. He looked at it. Then he drew a small circle around it, so he would find it again easily. Outside, the neighborhood continued its quiet. The stars were doing their ancient work. And in the deep interior of Issei Hayadu, the boosted gear pulsed once, slowly, like a heart deciding to beat harder. Chapter 7 Letters Without Addresses. Zenobia came to his house on a Tuesday. He was in the backyard doing forms, the repetitive movement exercises that Kiba had taught him in the first year, the ones he had continued every morning even when no one was grading him on them. She appeared at the garden gate, which he had left unlocked out of force of habit, and stood there watching him for a while before he noticed her. She was in her school uniform. Her blue-green hair was slightly windblown. She held a paper bag from the bakery near the station. Kaneko said you stopped coming to club meetings, she said, when he stopped and looked at her. Yes. She didn't say why. She just said it. Zenobia opened the gate and came in, because Zenobia operated on the principle that an unlocked gate was an invitation. I brought bread. From the good bakery. You didn't have to do that. No, she agreed, with the serene acceptance of someone who did not spend time defending choices she had already made. I wanted to. She held out the bag. Can I sit? They sat on the back step together. He opened the bag and there were 2 large rolls and something with cinnamon. He handed her one of the rolls and took the cinnamon thing for himself, because he had always had a particular fondness for cinnamon, and Zenobia somehow knew this even though he could not remember ever mentioning it. The whole club knows, she said. Not unkindly. As a statement of fact. The withdrawal letter. What happened before it? All of it. I assumed they would. It was handled badly, she said. Another statement of fact, delivered the way Zenobia delivered everything, with the complete absence of decorative language. You were not treated with the straightforwardness you deserved. I want you to know that I know that. He looked at the garden. His mother's tomatoes were doing well this year. The rose bush she had planted along the left fence was in its third season and had finally found its confidence. Thank you, he said. I have not left the peerage, Zenobia said. I want to be honest about that. My reasons for being here are my own, and they do not require me to choose sides in a political situation. She paused, eating her roll with the serious efficiency she brought to meals. My reason for being here is that you are my friend and I have not been a good one. You didn't know it was happening. I suspected something was not right. I asked no questions because I did not want to complicate my own position. She looked at him with the direct gaze that she turned on everything, the look of a person who believed that uncomfortable truth was simply truth and should be stated as such. That was a failure of friendship. I acknowledge it. Acknowledged, he said quietly, a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. The garden was peaceful in the way that a garden in the early afternoon always is, sun-warm and still. What will you do now? She asked. Get stronger. Figure out what I'm building. Stop letting other people decide what my strength is for. She nodded, slowly chewing. That is a good plan. Thank you. I mean it as genuine assessment, not encouragement. She brushed crumbs from her lap with great precision. You are going to become something difficult to predict, Haida. I have thought this for some time. Whatever you build will be significant. A pause. I intend to watch. Just watch? She considered this. Zenobia considering something looked like a very still painting of thought. That depends, she said finally, on what you ask for, and when. He almost smiled. Not quite. But almost. They finished the bread in the sunny garden, and did not speak again about politics or peerages or the weight of what had been lost. They spoke instead about nothing in particular, the small ordinary currency of people who know each other well enough to spend time without agenda. And when Zenobia left, she paused at the garden gate and turned back. Issei, she said. Yeah. Don't become something small because someone told you that you were. She left without waiting for an answer, which was correct because the statement required none. He stood in the garden for a while after she was gone, looking at his mother's tomatoes and his mother's roses, and the ordinary sky above the ordinary neighborhood. Don't become something small because someone told you that you were. He went back inside and picked up his notebook and wrote that down too. Chapter 8: The Architecture of Starting Over. A month into his independence, Issei began to train differently. Not the structured drills Rias had assigned, calibrated to develop him at a pace that was useful to her raiding game schedule. Not the reactive combat training that had been essentially preparation for specific opponents. He began to train toward what the boosted gear actually was, which was not, as Drake had told him, a hammer. It was an amplifier. An exponential function applied to whatever you brought to it. He began to train his perception first. If the boosted gear multiplied what was present, then cultivating clarity, awareness, precision of thought and sensation, would compound in ways that raw physical training would not. He meditated in the early morning before school, which was not something he had ever done before and which felt deeply strange for approximately 2 weeks before it began to feel like something else entirely. He trained his endurance through hiking rather than repetition. Long walks through the mountains on weekends, carrying more weight each time, learning the difference between the pain that builds and the pain that breaks. He was learning to read himself. He read. He had access, through the library permissions that had not yet been formally revoked in the Gremory estate administrative system, to a considerable archive of devil historical texts. He read about sacred gear development. He read about the history of the boosted gear specifically, the names and stories that Drake filled in from memory as he went. He read about independent devil factions and how they had formed, the organizational logic of them, the political grammar of the underworld beyond the great devil families. He was building a map. Not of the destination he had already chosen but of the terrain, so that when he chose a destination it would be based on actual knowledge rather than assumption. Asia came to study with him twice a week. She brought homemade cookies and grammar notes, and the easy warmth of her company, and they sat at his kitchen table working through their respective reading. She had begun studying advanced healing applications, expanding beyond the basics of twilight healing into specialized techniques. She said when he asked, that she wanted to be useful to him specifically, not to a peerage in general. He told her that she was useful to him specifically by existing and being herself, which made her turn pink and deny it, and then thank him in a small voice. Ireina appeared at his school 2 mornings a week before classes, which was technically unusual, and which the teachers had somehow been persuaded to overlook, to train with him in the sports field. She moved with the trained efficiency of a church warrior, all clean lines and decisive footwork, and she pushed him harder than she probably needed to, which he suspected was partly training methodology, and partly the competitive streak that she had possessed since childhood and had never entirely metabolized. She also talked constantly while they trained, which was initially distracting and eventually revealed itself to be a feature rather than a bug. She talked about church politics, about angel society, about things she had seen in her travels that she had never had a right audience for. He listened while his body did the work of the drills, and he found that learning through conversation suited a part of his mind that more formal study did not reach. One morning, 6 weeks into this new routine, he was running the track at school before sunrise when he heard footsteps matching his pace from the lane beside him. He looked over. Ross Weiss was running beside him, her silver hair pulled back, in athletic clothes she clearly did not wear often enough to be entirely comfortable in. Ross Weiss. Good morning. She was already slightly winded, which meant she had been running longer than he had. I have been here for 20 minutes. I was trying to decide whether to speak. What decided it? Running out of track to delay on. He almost laughed. He kept running and she kept pace, and they ran in silence for 1 full lap before she spoke again. I want to help you train, she said. Specifically the magical theory aspects of boosted gear application. I have written 3 papers on Longinus' theoretical development that were published in the underworld academic journals. None of which Ryosama ever asked me about. A pause. I have a great deal of specialized knowledge that has not been applied. He thought about what she was offering. Ross Weiss was, in his experience, one of the most technically knowledgeable people in the peerage, a trained Valkyrie with academic credentials that most devils twice her age would have respected. She had always seemed to him slightly misplaced in a combat-forward peerage, the way a master craftsman might feel misplaced in an army. Why are you bringing this to me? He asked. Because your development is no longer being managed by someone who has political reasons to underestimate it, she said, with the clinical clarity of someone who has chosen precision over diplomacy. And because the boosted gear has theoretical applications that have never been properly explored, and I would like to be the person who helps explore them. Another pause, shorter this time. Also because you have always been kind to me and I have always noticed that and done nothing about it. They ran another lap. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, he said. After school. We can use the abandoned gymnasium. She nodded. Very slightly, but with the quality of someone settling something into a definite place. I will prepare materials. The sky was beginning its early business of going pink at the edges. The track was still damp from night, and their footsteps were the only sound, and Issei ran and thought that the architecture of starting over was, it turned out, made of people who showed up. Chapter 9 The First Test. The request arrived on a Thursday, through the neutral communication channel that independent devils used when they needed to reach someone without going through a great house. Issei read the message twice to make sure he had understood it correctly. Then he read it a 3rd time. A small community of humans in a mountain town 3 hours from Ko had reported supernatural disturbances for 6 weeks. Low-level, probably a stray familiar or a minor territorial spirit that had gotten disoriented, but persistent enough to be causing genuine distress. The neutral registry of independent devil contractors listed him now, basic information only, Longinus class sacred gear, unaffiliated, available for consultation. Someone had found the listing and reached out. Someone was paying him to help people. He stood in his kitchen reading the message and felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately name. It was not excitement exactly, though it was adjacent to excitement. It was more like the sensation of a key turning in a lock that you had not known was locked. He replied, accepting the contract. Standard terms. Travel covered, fee upon resolution. Then he went to find Asia. She was in the school library when he located her, surrounded by 3 volumes of healing theory and a notepad covered in her careful small handwriting. She looked up when he sat down across from her, and registered his expression with the attentiveness she brought to faces. Something happened, she said. Something good, he said, and he realized as he said it that it was true. I have a contract. My first independent one. A community that needs help. Her face moved through a rapid sequence that settled on genuine warmth. When do we go? You don't have to come. She looked at him with patient precision. When do we go, Issei? He almost smiled. Actually smiled this time, small but real. Saturday morning? Early. She nodded and went back to her notes, with the serenity of someone who had settled a question and was ready to move on. He watched her for a moment, this person who had chosen him without calculation, who showed up with the quiet reliability of a tide. He pulled out his own notebook and started planning. Ireina insisted on coming when he told her Friday evening. She said it was because she was trained for field situations and her presence added tactical value. She said this with the particular energy of someone who has prepared a reasonable argument as cover for a simpler feeling. He did not point this out. He added her to the group. Rossweiss found out through Asia and sent him a research file on territorial spirits specific to the mountain region in question, organized into a 12-page document with diagrams, which he read on the train Saturday morning while the countryside moved past the window in its early mist. The town was small and quiet, nested in a valley with mountains on 3 sides. The people who met them were cautious but desperate in the way that people get when something frightening has become familiar enough that they have stopped being surprised by it, and started just being tired. They told him the story carefully. Animals acting strangely. Cold spots in the forest. Children waking from bad dreams. One man who had gone into the trees at dusk to check on his property, and had come back unable to explain clearly what he had seen. Issei listened. He asked questions. He took notes. Then he and Asia and Ireina went into the forest as the afternoon began to cool, and he opened himself to the boosted gear, not summoning it fully, just letting it extend his perception outward, the way you extend your hand in a dark room. He found it within 20 minutes. Not a territorial spirit. An old contracted familiar that had belonged to a devil family whose line had ended 70 years ago. It was confused and frightened and had been cycling through the same territorial behaviors for decades out of simple programming, because no one had ever formally released it from its contract. He talked to it. This was not something he had been taught specifically. He talked to it the way you talk to a frightened animal, carefully and without aggression, projecting steadiness through the boosted gear, which apparently amplified that too, because the familiar settled gradually and then, with considerable visible relief, allowed itself to be formally released through a simple dissolution rite that Rossweiss had included in her research file, which he had thought at the time was probably unnecessary, and now was profoundly grateful for. The walk back out of the forest took 20 minutes. The cold spot was already gone. The community gathered in the small square to hear his report. He explained what had happened in plain language, no jargon, no devil politics, just the situation and its resolution. They thanked him. The man who had paid the contract fee shook his hand with both hands and held on for a moment longer than strictly necessary. On the train home, sitting across from Asia who had fallen asleep against the window, Ireina leaned forward in her seat and looked at him with something bright in her expression. That was the right thing, she said. Quietly, so as not to wake Asia. Yeah, he said. Not the efficient thing. Not the impressive thing. The right thing. The way you talk to that familiar. She shook her head slightly. You didn't treat it like an obstacle. You treated it like something that needed help. He looked out the window at the passing countryside. The mist had cleared now and the mountains in the distance were clean and sharp against the evening sky. That's what it was, he said simply. Ireina looked at him for a moment longer than the sentence required. Then she settled back in her seat and looked out her own window, and the train moved through the evening, and nobody said anything else for a while because nothing else needed to be said. Chapter 10. What Rias saw. Rias Gremory heard about the mountain town contract through her network within a week. She sat in the occult research club room after school had emptied, with a cup of tea growing cold beside her, and the late afternoon light doing its usual warm work on the red of her hair, and she read the report that her intelligence contact had assembled. Brief. Factual. A straight familiar dissolution, resolved cleanly by an independent contractor. No complications. Community satisfied. The contractor was listed as Hayadu. Independent. Longinus class. She set the report down. She had expected, if she was honest with herself, a period of visible difficulty. She had expected the adjustment period that accompanied any peerage restructuring, a certain amount of displaced emotion, perhaps some ill-considered decisions. She had designed his departure, in the privacy of her own planning, as a clean severance. Manageable. She had not expected him to immediately, efficiently, begin building something. Kenneo entered the room quietly and set a fresh cup of tea beside the cold one. She looked at the report without touching it. Then she looked at Rias. He resolved it in under 3 hours, Kenneo said. I can read. He also used a familiar dissolution right that isn't in any standard training curriculum. He found it through independent research. A pause. Rosweiss contributed the source material. Rias picked up the new tea. Rosweiss remains in our peerage. She remains in our peerage, Kenneo agreed. She also, apparently, sends him research files on topics relevant to his contracts. The quality of Kenneo's voice was careful and neutral in a way that was itself a kind of commentary. She considers it a separate matter from her peerage obligations. Rias was quiet for a long moment. She was not, she told herself, concerned. She was observing. There was a difference. A former piece, exercising his independence, taking small contracts, building a modest reputation. This was entirely predictable. She had known when she approved the withdrawal, had known even as she reviewed the tribunal documents, that Issei's sacred gear meant he would not simply vanish into irrelevance. What she had not calculated was the speed, the clarity of direction. The people gathering around him, Ireina Shidu, who had church credentials and combat training and a history with him that predated all of them. Asia, who had followed him with the simplicity of complete trust. Rosweiss contributing expertise. And the reports she had heard, carefully not sought but presented to her anyway by people who knew they were relevant, of Zenovia's visit to his house, of conversations on school rooftops. She had told Kenneo 3 months ago that his feelings were his own responsibility. She had not told Kenneo about the moment last year, the one she had filed carefully away, when she had stood in the doorway of the training room and watched him push through a session that should have broken him, and had felt something that was not strategic assessment, and was not political calculation, and that she had decided, immediately and definitively, to categorize as irrelevant. She picked up the report again. He will keep going, she said. Yes, Kenneo said. The contracts will get larger. His reputation will build. She set the report down again. He is doing this correctly. Rias. Kenneo sat down across from her. Not in the pose of a subordinate. In the way she sat when she had something to say that she intended to say regardless of whether it was easy. Was it the right choice? What we decided. The room was very quiet. It was the politically rational choice, Rias said. That was not what I asked. Rias looked at her oldest friend, at the violet eyes that had known her since childhood, that knew exactly which questions she was not answering when she gave technically true responses. I don't know, she said finally. Which was, for Rias Gremory, an extraordinary thing to say. Kenneo nodded. Not with satisfaction. With the recognition of someone who had waited for a door to open. Then perhaps, Kenneo said quietly, it is worth thinking about what you actually know. The late afternoon light moved slowly across the floor. The tea cooled again. And Rias Gremory sat with the particular discomfort of someone who has been precise and strategic and correct, and who is beginning to wonder whether those qualities were applied to the right problem. Chapter 11. Kenneo speaks once. Kenneo found him on the school roof on a Wednesday. He had been up there often since leaving the club, the roof being one of those neutral territories that belonged to no particular group and therefore was available to anyone willing to climb 4 flights of stairs. He had his lunch. He had his notebook. He was running numbers on his contractor account, and thinking about training priorities. She appeared at the roof door and stood there for a moment, expressionless in the way that Kenneo was always expressionless, which was to say not actually expressionless but rather that her expressions were small and required practice to read. She was holding a rice ball wrapped in plastic. She sat beside him without preamble, and held out the rice ball. He took it. Thanks. She made a small sound that was not quite agreement, and not quite dismissal, and opened her own lunch. They ate in silence. This was not unusual. Kenneo in his experience had a high tolerance for silence that was not awkward, the kind of silence that two people who understood each other could share without it meaning anything beyond the sharing. You're louder now, she said, when they were most of the way through their lunches. He blinked. What? Your presence. It used to be focused in a specific direction, like a beam. Now it's more. She considered. Wider. Like it's filling the space it actually has. He thought about what she was describing. Kaneko's Nikomata perception was precise in a way that was not exactly sight, and not exactly feeling but was something accurate in both directions. She did not say things that were not true simply because they were nice. Is that a bad thing? He asked. She appeared to genuinely consider this. No. It's unfamiliar. Things that were one shape for a long time look strange when they change shape. Another pause. But it's the right shape for what it actually is. He looked at her. This small, contained person who had a habit of stating observations that other people took entire conversations to arrive at. Are you okay? He asked. With everything that happened, her expression moved in a way he had learned to read over 3 years. Something settled downward, something honest surfacing. I was angry, she said. At the situation. At not being told things I should have been told. A very small pause. I was also angry at myself for not saying something to you before it got to where it got. You were protecting your position. Yes. She looked at her lunch. That was also the wrong choice. She said it with the absolute absence of self-pity that made Kaneko's self-assessments feel like weight rather than performance. I know that, Kenneo. Yes. I'm not angry at you. He meant it. He had moved past the diffuse anger of the first week into something more specific, and Kenneo had never been in its target. You were in a difficult position, and you made the choices you had available to you. I understand that. She looked at him for a long moment. You are frustratingly good at understanding things that most people would use as reasons to be difficult, she said. I prefer the word generous. I prefer accurate. But there was something at the edge of her expression, very small, that might have been the outline of warmth. The things you're doing. The contracts. The training changes. Rossweiss talks about your boosted gear development the way she talks about her research, which is the closest she gets to enthusiasm. She's brilliant. I'm glad she's involved. She is. Kenneo finished her lunch and wrapped the packaging with precise efficiency. Issei. Yeah. She stood up, brushing non-existent crumbs from her uniform. She looked at him with the full weight of those amber eyes, and what was in them was not pity or guilt or the complicated residue of loyalty divided. It was something much simpler. Don't become a smaller version of yourself because of what happened, she said. Become the version that was always there. Then she went back to the stairwell door, and was gone before he had a chance to respond. He sat on the roof with the half-eaten rice ball she had given him and the city spread out below, and the sky above, and he thought that Kenneo, who spoke rarely and carefully, had just said in 2 sentences something that would probably stay with him for years. He wrote it in his notebook. Don't become a smaller version. Become the version that was always there. Then he finished his lunch and went back to class. Chapter 12 The Sparring Ground. Ireina hit him so hard with her redirected heavenly light that he flew backward through the air, cleared the boundary of the sparring area by 6 feet, and landed in an undignified heap in the long grass beyond. He lay there for a moment, looking at the sky. That was my fault, he called out. Yes, she called back, from somewhere above and to his left. You telegraphed the left pivot completely. I saw it coming from 2 steps away. He sat up. She was standing at the edge of the sparring area with her hands on her hips, her hair loose and somewhat chaotic from the session, her expression combining the satisfaction of someone who has just landed an excellent hit with the genuine critical assessment of a good teacher. They had been at this for 2 hours. The abandoned sports ground at the edge of the school grounds, which nobody used on weekends because it required a key that Ireina had obtained through means she described as church administrative access, and which he did not examine too closely. Again, he said, getting up. We've been going for 2 hours. Again. She looked at him for a moment. Then she moved back to her starting position with the comfortable efficiency of someone who has no objection to continuing. This was one of the things about training with Ireina. She never padded her assessments. When he did something wrong, she said so immediately, specifically, without the diplomatic softening that well-meaning trainers sometimes added and which delayed actual correction. When he did something right, she said that too, with equal immediacy. The result was that learning happened faster than it ever had. They ran the drill again. He watched her weight shift and calibrated his own movement accordingly, changing the pivot to a feint, converting what had been a commitment into a question, waiting for her to respond to the question before deciding his answer. She adapted. He adapted to her adaptation. The exchange lasted 11 seconds and ended in a controlled clinch where either of them had a clean advantage, which was effectively a success at this stage of their relative experience levels. They separated, breathing. Better, she said. You're a good teacher. She looked faintly surprised, as if the observation had arrived from an angle she had not expected. I just tell you what I see. That's what good teaching is. She tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was receiving something and was not entirely sure where to put it. Then she sat down on the grass and began unwrapping her hands, and he sat a few feet away and did the same, and the afternoon was warm around them, summer beginning to make its presence felt in the temperature and the quality of the light. Can I ask you something? He said. You don't have to ask. You can just ask. Why did you become a church warrior? The real reason? Not the official biography. She was quiet for a moment, working a knot from the cloth wrap. The question was not unkind. It was the kind of question that only gets asked between people who have decided that honesty is a mode they are operating in. When I was small, she said slowly, I believed very completely that there was a right side and a wrong side to every situation, and that the right side had clear markers you could recognize. The church gave me those markers. It gave me a framework where my instinct to protect people had a structure around it. She set down the unwrapped cloth. I'm older now. The framework is more complicated than I thought it was. But the instinct underneath it was always just that. I want to stand between things that hurt people and people who can be hurt. The church was just my first answer to how to do that. He listened to this with his full attention. And now? She looked at him. Now I'm finding more than one answer. A pause. Some of them involve sparring grounds and notebook-carrying dragon hosts and former nuns who make excellent tea. He felt warmth move through his chest that had nothing to do with the boosted gear. For what it's worth, he said, the instinct underneath it. The wanting to stand between. That part one recognized immediately. From when we were small. Ireina looked at the grass between them for a moment. You were always the person who ran toward the thing that needed dealing with, she said quietly. Before you even knew you could. Before there was a dragon or a sacred gear or any of it. She looked up. That's why what happened to you wasn't just unfair. It was a waste. Not a waste, he said. I learned things. I grew. The situation was wrong, but the growth was real. Yes. She considered this. That's a more generous read than I would have managed. You're generous too. You just call it something else. She made a sound that was attempting to be dismissive and not quite getting there. She gathered her wrapped cloth and her water bottle and stood up, brushing grass from her clothing. Same time next week, she said. Same time next week. She walked toward the gate, and he gathered his own things and followed, and the afternoon was golden and warm and the city was beginning its evening preparations, and Issei had to walk through it feeling, for the 4th or 5th time now, that the architecture of what he was building had another room in it that he had not previously seen the door to. Chapter 13 Research and Revelation. Rossweiss's approach to the theoretical development of the boosted gear was, Issei discovered, not unlike watching a master architect look at a building that everyone else had been using as a shed. They met 3 times a week in the abandoned gymnasium, which had somehow acquired 2 folding tables, a whiteboard, and 3 crates of reference text in the intervening time since Rossweiss had joined his training schedule. He did not ask about the provenance of the furniture. He suspected the answer involved Valkyrie logistics networks and official requisition forms. She taught. He listened. He asked questions. She answered them with the thoroughness of someone who had been waiting for someone to ask. The boosted gear, she explained, standing at the whiteboard with a marker and what appeared to be genuine happiness, was usually understood as a combat amplifier. This was accurate but severely incomplete. The doubling function applied to all aspects of the user's spiritual and physical capacities simultaneously, not only to the metrics that were relevant in a fight. The suppression of that comprehensive amplification had historically been achieved by training the user in narrow combat applications, which created a kind of voluntary blinkering of the system. Someone deliberately trained previous wielders to think small, Issei said, when she paused. She looked at him. That is one way to frame it. The more charitable interpretation is that combat was the most immediately relevant application, so that is what was developed. A pause. The less charitable interpretation is the one you suggested, yes. What does full-spectrum amplification actually look like? She turned back to the whiteboard and began drawing something that looked like a multidimensional model. We do not entirely know. The historical record is incomplete because most wielders never approached it. Drake, what do you have from memory? A pause. Then Drake spoke, aloud this time, which he could do when the boosted gear was partially active and which always had a quality of immense controlled presence, like a thunderstorm deciding to have a conversation. 2 wielders in recorded memory approached comprehensive application, Drake said. 1 in the 3rd century and 1 in the 11th. The 3rd century wielder used the amplification to develop what your current academic framework would classify as multi-domain perception. She could extend her awareness across significant distances and process multiple simultaneous information streams. She was not primarily a combatant. She was an advisor, a strategist, and the reason 3 kingdoms survived a plague that destroyed 2 others. A pause that had weight in it. She is the one I remember most clearly. The gymnasium was very quiet, Issei said. Yes. A warm quality in Drake's voice. She was extraordinary. She understood that the dragon's power was not there to make her the strongest person in a fight. It was there to make her the most complete version of herself that she could become. Rossweiss had stopped writing. She was looking at the space between herself and the wall with an expression that suggested she was recalibrating something significant. The academic literature has never included a female wielder in the historical record, she said quietly. The academic literature, Drake said, with the measured tone of someone who has been alive long enough to have opinions about academic literature, was written primarily by people who wanted the record to support a particular set of conclusions. Issei sat with this for a moment. Then he looked at Rossweiss. We're not training toward combat-optimized development, he said. No, she said, and something in her expression had shifted, the way light shifts when a cloud moves off the sun. We are apparently training towards something much more interesting. They worked for another 2 hours. She developed a framework on the whiteboard, revised it, expanded it, argued with herself about one section and changed it twice. He asked questions and Drake contributed from memory, and the afternoon moved through the high windows of the gymnasium in the slow progression of autumn light. When they were done, Rossweiss stood back and looked at the whiteboard with the expression of someone regarding a thing they have made and finding it genuinely good. This, she said, is the most interesting research project I have ever been involved in. More interesting than your published papers? Those were exercises in proving things that were already suspected. She picked up the eraser, then set it down without using it, apparently deciding to leave the board intact for next time. This is finding things that were not known. She turned to look at him. That is different. That is actually interesting. He smiled. He had a genuine fondness for her precision, for the way she said exactly what she meant without the social decoration that made other people's statements harder to read. It was a different quality than Kaneko's economy of expression or Zenovia's bluntness. Rossweiss said exactly what she meant because she had thought carefully about what she meant, and the 2 things were therefore exactly aligned. Same time Wednesday? He said. I will have additional material by Wednesday, she said, which was her way of saying yes while adding a supplement. He gathered his notes. She gathered hers. They left the gymnasium in the direction of their separate ways home, and the autumn evening was cool and clear, and Issei walked through it thinking about a woman in the 3rd century who had understood something about dragons and potential that nobody had written down correctly, and how he intended to understand it too. Chapter 14 The Night of the Second Contract. The second contract was not small. It came through the same neutral registry, but this time the client was a devil family of minor standing, 3 generations removed from any great house affiliation, who had a problem they could not solve internally and could not afford to bring to a major faction without creating political obligations they did not want. The problem was a sealed location, an old estate outside the city, that had been locked down by a ward system installed by a devil scholar 40 years ago. The scholar had died without leaving the dissolution key. Inside the sealed estate were family records that the client needed, records that pertained to lineage documentation in a dispute that would, if not resolved, result in the family losing their registered devil status entirely. It was a research problem wearing a lock. Issei read the brief on a Sunday afternoon with Rosweiss sitting across from him at his kitchen table, going through her own copy page by page with a red pen making careful marks. The ward system is pre-standardization, she said without looking up. The scholar would have been working from older methodology. Possibly Metatron-adjacent inscription techniques if the date is accurate. Is that good or bad? It is complex. But complexity is different from impossible. She made a note. I will need 2 days to research the specific inscription style. Then we should be able to identify the dissolution approach. 2 days is fine. Contract timeline is 2 weeks. She nodded and kept reading. He looked at his own copy and thought about the family in question. Minor standing. 3 generations removed from the great houses. Trying to preserve their registered status through legitimate documentation. They were not rich. The contract fee they had offered was honest but not generous, the number of people who have assessed their situation accurately, and given what they actually have rather than what they wish they had. He had already decided to accept before he finished reading. He went out that evening to meet Asia, who had asked him to walk with her to the small chapel near the station where she went sometimes, not for organized services but for the quietness of the space and the particular quality of light that came through the windows in the evening. He had been there before with her. It was a comfortable place, old stone and worn wood, without any of the supernatural complications that sacred spaces sometimes carried. They sat in a pew near the back and she was quiet for a while in the way she got quiet in places she found peaceful, present but still. How are you really? She asked eventually. Not as a conversation opener. As a genuine question from someone who had been waiting for the right moment. He thought about it honestly before answering, which was the only way he knew how to answer Asia. She would always know if he gave her the social version instead of the real one. Better, he said. Every week I feel more like myself. Like the actual version of myself rather than the role I was occupying. He paused. That sounds strange. It sounds accurate. She turned her head to look at him. In the chapel light she looked very serene, the way she got in places that fed the part of her that was still quietly devout despite everything the church had done to her. You were always too large for the shape you were being asked to hold, she said. I noticed it, and didn't say anything. I'm saying it now. You noticed that? From the beginning. She folded her hands in her lap. You treated everyone you met as if they were worth treating carefully. Devils, angels, humans, a confused familiar in a mountain forest. She paused. That is not a quality that someone developed for political convenience. That is who you are. The chapel was quiet around them. A candle on the altar end moved in a draft, making the light pulse gently. Asia, he said. Yes. Thank you for being my friend. Specifically. I want to say it clearly so there's no ambiguity about it. She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry but lived in the territory between them. You say things like that and expect me not to react dramatically. I've never expected you not to react dramatically. I find your dramatic reactions charming. She turned pink and he felt warmth move through the whole of his chest, and he thought that this, specifically this, was one of the things he had been working toward without knowing its name. The ability to sit in a quiet chapel with someone who had chosen him and say true things and have them received without conditions. He was building toward it. He was getting there. Outside, the city continued its evening. Inside, the candle on the altar continued its gentle motion. And Issei Hayate sat in a pew with Asia Argento and felt the specific peace of someone who is, for the first time in a long time, exactly where they chose to be. Chapter 15. What Sona noticed. Sona Citri had a habit of noticing things that were not yet visible to anyone else. This was not a supernatural ability. It was the result of deliberate attention combined with a refusal to see what she expected instead of what was actually there. What she noticed, over the 6 weeks following Issei Hayate's formal independence, was a pattern. 2 contracts completed. Both resolved without a single complaint, without collateral damage, without the political complications that frequently attended independent devil work in the neutral zones. 1 community satisfied and vocal about it. 1 minor family with their lineage documentation intact and their registered status preserved. Word traveled in the underworld through channels that were not official and were therefore faster and more accurate than the official ones. The word traveling about Hayate, independent contractor, Longinus class, was simple and consistent, reliable, thoughtful, fair. She sat at her desk in the student council office on a Thursday morning before school started, with a cup of tea at her right hand and a file at her left, and thought about what she was seeing. She was not sentimental about Issei Hayate. She had never been close to him in the way that his former peerage members were close to him. She had observed him from a position of appropriate neutrality, through the lens of a rival king watching a peace develop, and what she had observed had always been more than the Gremory house appeared to be using. She had filed his withdrawal without comment beyond what the process required. She had noted the Longinus status in the record as a statement of fact. She was beginning to think she had been underattending to something that merited more of her attention. She opened the file. It contained, in addition to the contractor reports, her own observations from various contexts, the training sessions she had been told about through school staff who noticed unusual early morning activity, the library usage logs that showed a systematic research approach rather than reactive browsing, the connections forming around him that were notable not for their power but for their quality. People who had chosen him specifically. Not his position. Not what he could provide politically. Him. She picked up her pen and wrote in the margin of the file organizational formation. Prefaction stage. Cohesion basis personal loyalty, shared values. Growth trajectory significant. She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote note for follow-up. Direct conversation. Timeline appropriate interval. She closed the file and picked up her tea. Tsubaki, her queen, entered the office with her morning briefing materials and stopped briefly in the doorway, reading Sona's expression with the fluency of long familiarity. You have that look, Tsubaki said. What look? The look where you have observed something that other people have not caught up to yet, and you are deciding how to proceed. Sona straightened her glasses. I observe many things. Yes. Tsubaki came fully into the office and began organizing the morning materials with her customary efficiency. It's the Hayate situation. What makes you say that? Because it's the thing in your peripheral vision that you keep not quite looking at directly. Tsubaki set down a folder. He resolved the Kimura family lineage dispute. The Kimuras are minor, but they have connections to 3 Mitter families who are paying attention to who helped them. The ripple is already visible to anyone watching for it. Sona looked at her queen with the appreciation she always felt for intelligence that matched her own in practical analysis. Yes, she said. That is approximately what I was thinking. What are you going to do? Sona considered. She picked up her pen again, turned it in her fingers once, set it down. I am going to let the pattern continue to develop, she said, and when the appropriate moment arrives, I am going to have a direct conversation. She looked at the closed file. Hayate has never been someone who needs to be managed. He needs to be treated as a peer. I intend to do that. Tsubaki nodded. He will appreciate that. I know. Sona picked up her tea again. That is partly why I intend to do it. The morning light came through the student council office windows, regular and clear, and Sona Citri began her day with the focused deliberateness of someone who understands that the most important moves are often the ones made before anyone else realizes a game has begun. Chapter 16 The Dragon Speaks at Length. Drake spoke at length on a Thursday night when Issei could not sleep. Not training-related. Not tactical. Drake spoke the way he sometimes did when the hour was late, and the world was quiet, and there was space for things that were not urgent, but were important in a different way. The way an elder speaks to someone young enough to still be choosing the shape of themselves. He told Issei about the centuries. Not all of them. The outline of them. What it had meant to pass through so many conflicts, so many wielders, so many versions of the same essential contest between power wielded for domination and power wielded for something else. He told Issei about the vanishing dragon, Albion, about the rivalry that had been constructed around them both, the narrative of eternal opposition that served the purposes of people who wanted two enormous forces pointed at each other rather than at anything else. That rivalry, Issei said quietly, lying in the dark of his room, was political. Most rivalries are, Drake said. Albion and I were never enemies by nature. We were positioned as enemies by circumstance, by the needs of others, by stories that became self-fulfilling over centuries of retelling. We fought because the story said we fought, and because the fighting produced outcomes that were useful to people who were not us. Do you hate him? A long pause. No. I have not hated him in a very long time. I understand him, which is a different thing. We are both very old and very tired of being the symbols people make us into, rather than the things we actually are. Issei thought about that. About being made into a symbol. About how his entire 3 years in the Gremory peerage had been partly about the symbol of having a Longinus, the political value of it, the strategic weight of it, rather than the actual reality of him and the dragon in his chest. What are you, actually? He asked. If not the symbol. Another pause, this one longer, with the quality of something being considered very carefully. I am something very old, Drake said, that has been searching, across a great many lifetimes, for a wielder who understood that we are not a weapon waiting to be used. We are a partnership waiting to be chosen. His voice had shifted, become quieter, with a quality Issei had never heard in it before. Something that was not quite vulnerable but was adjacent to it. Most wielders took me as an instrument. They were not wrong to do so. The instrument frame is available and useful, and many of them did remarkable things with it. But it was always partial. It was always less than what this could be. What could it be? What we are choosing to make it, Drake said. You and I. A dragon and a boy who turns toward the things that need dealing with before he even has the power to deal with them. I have been waiting for this particular conversation for a very long time, partner. Issei lay in the dark and felt the ember warmth of the boosted gear in his chest, not distant as it sometimes was when dormant but present, fully present, the way a fire feels when you are close enough to be warm without being close enough to be burned. Drake, he said. Yes. Thank you. For staying. For all of them. All of whom? All the wielders. Even the ones who treated you like a tool. You stayed and you waited and you kept the thing intact. He paused. That took something. The silence was longer this time. And when Drake spoke again there was something in his voice that Issei would later struggle to describe, not to anyone else but to himself, when he tried to understand what had changed that night. The closest he could get was this: it sounded like a door that had been closed for a very long time, opening. It did, Drake said quietly. And it was worth it. Issei closed his eyes. The night was quiet around him. The ember in his chest pulsed steadily, warmly, like something certain. He slept, and did not dream of open sky this time. He dreamed of fire that did not burn, and the vast calm presence of something ancient choosing, freely and finally, to be exactly where it was. Chapter 17 Letters that Arrive. The letter from the Rating Game Commissioner's office arrived on a Monday. It was addressed formally to Hayadu, Independent Devil, Longinus class, and it contained a brief, precisely worded invitation to register as an observer at the upcoming Junior Rating Game Invitational, on the basis of his independent contractor status and the recommendation of an unnamed advisor to the Commissioner's office. He read it 3 times. Then he took it to Rosweiss, who read it once and made a specific face. Someone is watching you, she said. Someone is always watching. The question is who and why. The Commissioner's office does not extend observer invitations to newly independent contractors without reason. The observer access for this event includes the pre-match briefings and the strategic planning sessions. She set the letter down. Whoever requested this wants you to see how rating games are run at the organizational level. Sona Citri, he said. Rossweiss blinked. Then, slowly, she nodded. The style matches. Information without direct obligation. She is letting you see the board before suggesting you play. He thought about Sona, about the careful precision of how she operated, about the note in her office that he did not know she had written but that he could have predicted almost word for word if asked. I'll go, he said. I assumed you would. Will you come? She paused. The pause had the quality of someone who had not expected to be asked, and was now recalibrating toward yes faster than they were going to show. I have extensive analytical experience with rating game theory, she said. My presence would add value to the observation. Yes, he said, straight-faced. That is why I asked? She gathered her papers with the efficiency of someone moving on from a moment they did not want examined further. He wrote to the Commissioner's office accepting the invitation. He did not write to Sona directly. He understood that she would know, and that the space between the invitation and the response was exactly the size of a conversation that was not yet ready to happen. That evening he told the others. Asia clasped her hands and said that she hoped he would tell them everything he saw. Ireina said she wanted to come, then reconsidered on the grounds that her church credentials at a devil event might create unnecessary complexity, then said she still wanted to come, then settled on wanting a detailed debrief afterward. Zenobia, informed by text, replied with a single line good. Let them see what they trained and then released. He read that message twice. Then he wrote back thank you. She replied don't thank me. Be visible. He put his phone down and looked at the ceiling of his room, and thought about visibility. About being seen clearly rather than strategically. About what it meant to walk into a room full of devil politics as exactly himself, no more and no less, without the frame of someone else's peerage around him defining what he was before he had a chance to demonstrate it. He thought about what Drake had said. A partnership waiting to be chosen. He reached up in his mind and touched the ember of the boosted gear, the warmth of it, the vast patient presence of the dragon. He felt it respond, a pulse of recognition, of welcome. Ready? He said to the dark ceiling, to the dragon, to himself. The ember pulsed again. Warm. Steady. Certain. That was answer enough. Chapter 18 The Invitational. The Rating Game Commissioner's Invitational was held in a purpose-built facility on the eastern edge of the Underworld's administrative district, a structure that managed to be simultaneously impressive and deliberately neutral, the architectural equivalent of a handshake that commits to nothing. Issei arrived in the clothes he had decided on carefully, not a uniform because he did not belong to any house, not the casual dress of someone who had not thought about it, but a plain dark jacket over a gray shirt, clean and considered, the clothes of someone who had showed up on his own terms and was entirely comfortable with that. Rossweiss was beside him. She had dressed with her own precise care, academic professional, the bearing of someone who had credentials and was not required to announce them. The foyer was full of devil nobility. Junior representatives of the great houses, their attendants and advisors, the periphery of observers and staff and political assessors who attended every event of this kind and formed the real intelligence network of the underworld regardless of what the official channels pretended. He felt the shift in attention when he entered. Not dramatic. A flicker, the way a room registers a new variable without anyone formally acknowledging it. The Longinus signature was not something that could be disguised at close range, and an unaffiliated Longinus wielder walking into a rating game event was a sufficiently unusual combination to register on anyone paying attention. He walked into it without adjusting his pace. The observer area was elevated, with a clear view of the game field and access to the briefing materials that the competing teams were using. He took his seat and opened the briefing packet and read it with full attention, because the point of being here was to understand, not to be seen understanding, though he was aware that being seen was also happening. Rossweiss sat beside him and had, he noticed, already produced her own notepad. The games began. He watched with the attentiveness that Drake's perceptual amplification made possible, not the surface observation of someone watching for entertainment, but the layered tracking of someone reading a system. Strategy layers. Communication patterns between pieces and king. The moments where the game plan adapted and the moments where it failed to adapt, and what those failures cost. He took notes. Rossweiss took notes. They did not compare them during the matches, both of them understanding that the comparison would be more useful afterward when the impressions had settled. Between the second and third matches, someone sat down in the empty seat to his left. He looked over. Sona Citri settled into the seat with the practiced ease of someone who had chosen it deliberately, and was comfortable with that being known. She was wearing the formal attire of a junior king observer, precise and undecorated. She looked at the field rather than at him. The third match will be more interesting, she said. The Eastern team has been running a modified pawn advancement strategy that the analysts have missed because they are watching for a more conventional approach. He looked at the field. He found what she was describing within 30 seconds. The bishop is the pivot. They're using the rook feints as cover for bishop repositioning. A pause. Yes. They watched together for 3 minutes without speaking further. Then Sona said, still watching the field, "Your contractor work has been well received. The Kimura family has spoken favorably to several connected families. The mountain town community submitted a written commendation to the neutral registry, which is unusual. I didn't know about the commendation. I assumed you didn't. You do not seem like someone who checks his own reviews." Something that might, on a different face, have been dry amusement. They described you as treating the situation with care. That word appears 3 times in the letter. It was a frightened familiar that had been alone for 70 years. Care seemed appropriate. Another pause, this one with a different quality. Consideration rather than silence. "You are building something," Sona said. Not a question. "I'm figuring out what I'm building," he said. "The building comes after the figuring. That is a more patient approach than most people your age take. Most people my age haven't been running on someone else's timeline for 3 years. Patience feels different when it's yours." On the field, the third match had begun. The Eastern team's bishop was already moving into position, subtle, 3 steps into a sequence that would only be visible as a sequence from where Issei sat. "I intend to speak with you more formally at some point," Sona said. "When you are ready for that conversation. I'll let you know when." "That is the correct answer." She stood. "Enjoy the remaining matches, Hayato. You are asking the right questions." She returned to the official observer section without looking back, the way people move when they have said exactly what they intended and require no confirmation that it landed. He watched the third match. The Eastern team's bishop executed the pivot on the 7th move, exactly as he had anticipated, and the Western king spent 30 seconds recalibrating before responding. Those 30 seconds cost them the match. He wrote in his notebook, 30 seconds of adjustment time is the difference. Build systems that don't require adjustment. Rossweiss leaned over and read it. She underlined it twice without asking permission. He did not mind. Chapter 19. After the games. The reception that followed the invitational was held in a high-ceilinged room that someone had arranged with a great deal of effort to look effortless. Tall windows. Candlelight layered over ambient illumination. The controlled geometry of people navigating each other's social orbits with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed dance. Issei moved through it at the pace of someone who was watching rather than seeking. He had a glass of something that had been given to him without request, which he held and occasionally drank from while the room did what rooms like this did, which was to simultaneously be about nothing and to be entirely about everything. He was approached 4 times in the first hour. The first was a junior representative of a mid-tier house who wanted to know, with careful casualness, whether he was considering any peerage affiliations. He said, with equal casualness, that he was focused on independent development for the present. The representative nodded and moved on. The second was a rating game analyst who had been in the observer section and had noticed his note-taking and wanted to discuss strategy theory. This was a genuinely interesting conversation and lasted 15 minutes and ended with the exchange of contact information, which was the first time he had exchanged contact information with someone at an event like this who was not already in his life. The third was a representative from the Phoenix House. This one was less casual about its purpose. The Phoenix family had an interest in the boosted gear's reputation and in the question of what an unaffiliated Longinus wielder represented in terms of political possibility. The representative was polished and professional and completely transparent once you knew how to read the genre. He was polite. He was pleasant. He committed to nothing and offered nothing that could be construed as an opening. The Phoenix representative withdrew with the grace of someone accustomed to this particular outcome. The fourth approach was not an approach at all, exactly. He had drifted toward the window end of the room, the quieter section, when he became aware of someone standing nearby who was also drifting toward the window end for the same reasons. He looked over. The girl was approximately his age, with pale silver-white hair and eyes that were a very light gray, almost colorless, with the quality of winter sky right before it decides whether to snow. She was wearing the attire of a neutral observer, no house insignia, which was unusual at an event where everyone else had something displayed. She noticed him noticing and did not look away. "You are the independent Longinus," she said. Not rudely. As an identification. "That's one way to describe me," he said. "It is the way most people in this room are describing you. I thought you should know, since you seem to be the only person here unaware of how much attention you are receiving." "I'm aware," he said. "I just don't find it very interesting." Something shifted in her expression. Recalibration. "My name is Elmenhild," she said. "I am here as an observer from a northern faction that prefers to remain unspecified at social events. Issei Hayadu. I'm here because someone thought it would be useful for me to see this." He paused. Was what? Useful. For you. Being here. A longer pause. She looked at the room beyond the window glass, at the city lights that the underworld had arranged to suggest a city. "I come to these events because my faction requires intelligence on raiding game developments," she said. "Whether it is useful in the way that I personally find things useful is a separate question that I do not usually ask." She paused. "You asking it is unusual. People don't usually ask? People at events like this do not usually ask questions that assume the person they are speaking to has personal preferences distinct from their political function." He looked at her. She was watching him with the specific quality of someone who had been watching people for a long time, and had not very often been watched back. "For what it's worth," he said, "you seem like someone who finds a great many things interesting that you are not currently supposed to find interesting." The winter sky eyes widened slightly. Not offended. Surprised. Then she made a sound that was perhaps the outline of a laugh, contained immediately, but real. "That," she said, "is an accurate observation." They stood by the window and talked for 40 minutes, about raiding game theory and northern faction politics and the particular experience of being at an event where everyone is performing a version of themselves that is approximately 60% true. She was sharp and somewhat starved for conversation that did not have a political agenda embedded in it, and he gave her the agenda-free version because that was simply how he talked. When the reception began its winding down, she gave him a contact point. "A neutral address, no house insignia. You may find," she said, with the careful phrasing of someone who has measured the sentence before speaking it, "that not all northern perspectives are as territorial as the reputation suggests." "I'll keep that in mind," he said. She walked away into the dissolving reception, and Rosweiss materialized at his elbow from somewhere to his left. "Elmenhild Karnstein," Rosweiss said quietly. "Vampire nobility. Northern European faction. Her house has been politically isolated for 30 years due to a conflict with the Bale family." A pause. "She spoke to you for 40 minutes. She has not spoken to anyone at this event for more than 3. He looked at the space where Elmenhild had been. "She was interesting," he said simply. "Yes," Rosweiss said. "I think perhaps that is the point." Chapter 20. The heart of the matter. Ireina was waiting outside his house when he got home. This was not alarming. Ireina had a habit of arriving at locations before the person she intended to meet, which she attributed to logistical planning, and which he attributed to the fact that she found waiting easier than the alternative. She was sitting on the front step with her knees drawn up, in a light jacket against the autumn evening, looking at her phone. She looked up when he came through the gate. "How was it?" she said. "Interesting." He sat beside her on the step. The night was cool and clear, and the neighborhood was doing its quiet evening routine of lights coming on in windows and the distant sound of someone's television. Sona Citri talked to you. How did you know? Because she's been watching the situation and she operates on approximately a 6-week development curve before initiating direct contact, and it has been 6 weeks. She put her phone away. What did she say? He told her. She listened with the focused attention she gave to information that she considered relevant, which was a different quality from her ordinary listening. Her ordinary listening was warm and responsive. This was precise, like a compass needle finding north. She's building toward a proposal, Ireina said when he finished. She's not ready to make it yet, but she's clearing the ground. Probably. Does that concern you? He thought about it. Not in the way you might expect. Sona doesn't operate in bad faith. Whatever she's building toward, it'll be something she thinks is genuinely reasonable. The question is whether it's what I want. Do you know what you want? He looked at the street. A cat was crossing it with the dignity that cats bring to all their movements, unhurried, committed to its own agenda. More than I did 3 months ago, he said. Less than I will 3 months from now. It's a process. She was quiet for a moment. The cat completed its crossing and disappeared behind a hedge. Issei, she said. Yeah. Can I say something that might be slightly difficult? He looked at her. Ireina, who was consistently honest with him, was only this formal in her phrasing when she was about to say something that she had been thinking about for long enough that it had developed weight. Go ahead, he said. I think you are extraordinarily good at understanding other people and significantly less practiced at understanding yourself. She said it directly but not unkindly, the way she said things when she had thought about them carefully. You listened to Kenneo, and you understood immediately what she meant. You listened to Rosweiss, and you understood the research direction before she finished explaining it. You read Sona's strategy from 3 interactions. She paused. But when I ask you what you want, you give me a process answer instead of a feeling answer. He sat with this. What is the feeling answer? He asked. I don't know. That is yours to figure out. She looked at him with the direct warmth that was her particular quality, the thing that had been true of her since they were children, the ability to see someone clearly and not flinch from what she saw. But I think it involves more than strength and independence and building something. I think there is a version of what you want that has people in it, specific people, in a specific way, and I think you are not quite ready to look at it directly yet. The night was quiet around them. He could hear his mother moving around in the kitchen through the closed front door. You're probably right, he said finally. I am right. But I said probably out of courtesy. The corner of her mouth moved. Take your time with it. I am not going anywhere. Something in him settled when she said that. Something that had been slightly taut, slightly careful, released by a few words spoken with complete honesty. Ireina, he said. Yes. You have been one of the most important parts of this. Of all of it. I want you to know that. She looked at the street for a moment. Then she looked back at him, and what was in her face was complicated in the way that real feelings are, layered and genuine and not entirely resolved. I know, she said quietly. That is why I am still here. They sat on the front step until the night got properly cold, talking about nothing in particular with the ease of people who have known each other through enough versions of themselves that the present version requires no explanation. When she finally stood to leave, she paused at the gate. Think about the feeling answer, she said. When you're ready. He watched her walk down the street until the corner took her, and then he sat on the step for another few minutes alone with the quiet night, and the particular awareness that some truths approach at their own pace, and cannot be rushed, only acknowledged when they arrive. Chapter 21 The Third Contract, and What It Cost. The third contract nearly killed him. This was not what he had expected. The brief had described a containment situation, a low-ranking devil who had undergone an uncontrolled power surge and needed to be brought back from the edge before they damaged themselves or anyone nearby. Standard intervention. His contractor profile had the clause for sacred gear crisis mediation because Drake had suggested including it, and Rosweiss had agreed it was a legitimate application. What the brief had not fully communicated, because the people filing it did not entirely know, was that the uncontrolled surge was being driven not by simple power imbalance but by a resonance phenomenon involving an old binding contract that had cracked under pressure. The cracked contract was leaking energy in a pattern that interacted badly with sacred gear signatures. He found this out when he got within 20 feet of the situation, and the boosted gear began responding to the leaking energy in a way he had not prepared for. The amplification kicked in sideways. Not the straightforward doubling he was accustomed to, but a resonance amplification, the boosted gear picking up the external energy and compounding it with his own, creating a feedback loop that Drake had to forcibly interrupt. "Partner." Drake's voice was sharp and immediate. "Withdraw." Now, he withdrew. He got back 40 feet, and the resonance dropped to a manageable level, and he stood there with his heart going considerably faster than he preferred and his left arm tingling from elbow to fingertip, and thought carefully about what he had just encountered. He did not go back in immediately. He called Rosweiss. She answered on the second ring, listened to his description, and talked him through a modified approach in real time, her voice calm and precise, the voice of someone who had prepared for scenarios that others would have called edge cases. 20 minutes later he went back in, with the boosted gear running at a fraction of its normal extension, using only the perceptual aspects while suppressing the amplification function, and he spent 40 minutes talking the surging devil down through a combination of measured calm, Drake's stabilizing presence, and one specific technique Rosweiss had identified that involved redirecting the cracked contract's leak outward rather than trying to contain it inward. It worked. The surge stabilized. The devil, a young woman about his own age who had been terrified and exhausted and enormously relieved when it was over, sat on the floor of her apartment and cried in the quiet way of someone whose body has decided it cannot hold any more adrenaline. He stayed until she was calm. He made her tea, because there was tea in the kitchen and making tea was something useful to do with your hands when your hands needed to be useful. He explained what had happened with the contract crack and what she would need to do to have it formally addressed by a contracted specialist. When he left, she called after him from the doorway. "Why did you stay?" He looked back. She was holding the tea mug, standing in the light from her apartment, looking young and tired and bewildered by his presence in her crisis. "Because you needed someone to," he said simply. He walked back to the train station and sat on the platform bench and let himself feel, for the first time since leaving the situation, the proper weight of how close it had been. Not dramatic. Just honest. That had been a near thing. His lack of preparation for the resonance phenomenon had been a genuine gap. He called Rosweiss from the platform. "I'm adding resonance interference scenarios to your research list," he said when she answered. "I already have," she said. "I started a file 20 minutes ago when you described the feedback loop." A pause. "Are you all right?" "Yes." "Embarrassed by the gap in preparation?" "Do not be embarrassed. That scenario is not in any standard training curriculum because no one has formally documented the resonance interaction between active sacred gear signatures and cracked binding contracts. We have now documented it." Another pause, warmer this time. "You managed it. You adapted in real time. That is the relevant outcome." He looked at the train tracks. The train was a minute away according to the board. "Thank you," he said. "For being available. For knowing what to do. That is what I am here for." She said it simply, without deflection. "Rest tonight. We have work tomorrow." He took the train home and sat in the window seat and watched the city move past, and Drake was quiet in his chest, not absent but still, the way the dragon got when something had happened that was worth sitting with before talking about. Eventually Drake said, quietly, "You handled that well. I nearly didn't." The recognition of a gap and the decision not to proceed into it unprepared is not failure. It is judgment. A pause. "Many people far older than you would not have withdrawn when I told them to. They would have pushed through on instinct and made the situation considerably worse." Another pause. "You trusted me." He thought about that. About the absolute immediacy of his response to Drake's warning, no argument, no pride-driven hesitation. Just withdrawal. "You've never given me a reason not to," he said. The dragon was quiet for a moment. "Then no. And I never intend to." The train moved through the autumn night. The city lights blurred at the edges of the window and clarified again, Again, the rhythm of it something close to steady, close to certain, close to the feeling that the ground under him was real. Chapter 22 Asia's Garden. Asia had a small garden. It occupied approximately 4 square feet of the windowsill of her rented room, which she had arranged into a series of clay pots containing herbs, one small tomato plant that had produced 2 tomatoes and was enormously proud of this, and a trailing vine of something green she had been given at a market, and could not identify but had decided to cultivate anyway. She showed it to him on a Sunday afternoon when he had come by to walk to the market with her. She showed it with the particular quality of pride that only belongs to people who have grown something they were not entirely sure they could grow. He stood at her windowsill and looked at the small garden and felt something move in him that was not quite the word fond but was the concept behind it. The recognition of someone being exactly themselves in a moment so natural that it became briefly luminous. "The tomatoes are very successful," he said. "They exceeded all expectations," she said seriously. "I was not confident. The light in this room is not ideal. But they managed. Determined tomatoes. Extremely." She touched one of the herb pots gently, checking the soil with her fingertip in the way she had learned from a video, and applied with complete dedication. "I thought about what you said. About building towards something real. I have been doing that too, in my own way. The healing research. The garden." She looked at him. "It helps to have things you are tending. Things that require you to show up. That's wisdom," he said. "It is probably very ordinary wisdom. The kind that everyone has known for a long time. The ordinary kinds are often the ones that are actually true." She smiled, and turned back to her windowsill, and began talking about the herbs with the informative enthusiasm of someone who had been researching a topic and found an audience willing to receive what they had learned. He listened with genuine attention. She knew a great deal about herbs now. She had correlated several of them with their historical uses in both human medicine and supernatural healing application, a research thread that had started as a casual interest and developed into something with actual practical relevance. He asked questions. She answered them precisely and then asked him questions back about the resonance interference situation, which he had told her about the day before, and she listened to his account of the technique Rosswise had walked him through and then said, quietly but with certainty, that there was a healing application that might interface with the same mechanism. He blinked. "What do you mean?" "Twilight healing at its advanced applications works through harmonic resonance. It does not force healing. It creates conditions where healing becomes the path of least resistance." She was thinking out loud now, the way she got when an idea was forming and she was following it. If the feedback loop you encountered was resonance-based, a specific healing harmonic might be able to interrupt the cycle without requiring you to suppress the boosted gear entirely. You could potentially operate at fuller capacity with a dampening layer. He looked at her. "Asia, I would need to test it. I would need to research the specific frequency Rosswise identified and correlate it with twilight healing application ranges. It might not work." She was still thinking, her fingers moving slightly as if counting variables. "But the theoretical framework is sound." "That is a brilliant idea," he said. She blinked, came back from the thinky place she had been in, and looked at him with surprise that was slightly too genuine to be modesty. "Is it?" "Absolutely. Talk to Rosswise this week. She will love this." "You think so?" Rosswise's research face appears when something she did not expect to be connected turns out to be connected. This will produce that face immediately. Asia made a sound that was almost a laugh, covered it with her hand, then uncovered it because it was real and she had stopped apologizing for real reactions. "All right," she said. "I will talk to her." They went to the market afterward, walking in the Sunday afternoon with shopping bags and no particular agenda, and she bought 3 more herb varieties and discussed their properties with the market vendor for 10 minutes while Issei stood beside her and listened and thought that this, also, was part of what he was building toward. Not only strength and contracts and political positioning. This. Afternoon walks. Small brilliant ideas proposed over windowsill gardens. The specific warmth of being known by people who had chosen to know you. He was building toward this too. He had just needed to be patient enough to recognize it. Chapter 23 What Kenneo decided. Kenneo Himejima made her decision on a Tuesday in November. She had been moving toward it for 8 weeks, since the evening she had asked Rias the question that Rias had answered honestly for the first time. She had been cataloguing the distance between what had been done and what should have been done, not angrily but with the careful precision of someone doing a long overdue inventory. She found him in the school library after classes, which was where she had expected to find him because his patterns were consistent, and she had been paying attention to them longer than she had admitted to anyone, including herself. She sat across from him at the table. He looked up from his reading. He did not seem surprised to see her, which was either because he had noticed her entering or because he had learned, in the years of knowing her, to calibrate his reactions to things that required a certain quality of attention. "Kenneo," he said. "Issei." She folded her hands on the table. "I owe you an apology." "You don't have to." "I do. Please let me." She held his gaze. In public Kenneo was all light and warmth, and the particular grace of someone who had learned to perform ease so well that most people forgot it was a performance. In this moment she was not performing. She was simply herself, which was a different and more careful thing. I knew the direction the situation was moving before it moved. I did not say anything because I told myself it was not my place. That was not true. The true reason was that I was afraid of complicating my own position and my relationship with Rias. A pause. I chose myself. That was wrong. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Is Rias all right?" Kenneo blinked. Of all the responses she had prepared for, that was not among them. She is. She considered. She is thinking. More than she was before. I believe the situation affected her in ways she is still processing. "I'm not angry at her," he said, which was not quite the same as saying things were fine but was something real. "I was, for a while. I'm not now. What happened was a set of choices made by people under pressure, including her. I understand the pressure even when I don't agree with the choices." "You are frustratingly reasonable," Kenneo said, and her voice had shifted, the warmth in it less performed and more direct, the warmth of someone who is genuinely moved and is permitting that to be visible. "I've been told," he said. "I wanted to tell you something else," she said. "Beyond the apology." "Go ahead." She looked at her folded hands for a moment. Then back at him. "I have been watching what you are building. The contracts. The way you handle situations. The people who are choosing to be part of this." She paused. "You are doing it right, Issei. Not the strategic right. The actual right. The way that lasts." "Thank you. I mean it as observation, not encouragement." She smiled, and it was a real one, the small kind that costs something because it is genuine. "I also want you to know that if there is ever something I can contribute, I would like to. Not from guilt. From choice." Another pause. "Those are different things." He held her gaze. In the library around them other students moved quietly through the stacks, absorbed in their own purposes, unaware of the specific weight of what was being said at this table in the afternoon light. "I know they are," he said. "Good." She unfolded her hands and gathered herself with the grace that was hers whether she was performing it or not. "Then I will say that the door is open, from my side, whenever you are ready." She stood. She paused. "He was always more than a stepping stone," she said quietly. "I should have said that at the time. I am saying it now, late, but I am saying it." She walked out of the library, and he watched her go, and then he looked at his book and did not read it for a few minutes, sitting with the specific feeling of a wound that has been properly acknowledged and has accordingly begun, quietly, to close. Chapter 24 Kiba's Question. Kiba found him on the running track at 5:30 in the morning, which suggested the meeting was not accidental. He was doing the long, slow laps he used for thinking, the pace that kept the body occupied without demanding the mind's full attention, freeing something up for the less conscious kind of processing. Kiba came through the track gate in his own running clothes and fell into pace beside him without preamble, which was the kind of thing Kiba could do because he had the natural social grace of someone who had never needed to announce himself. They ran one full lap in silence. The sky was the pre-dawn blue that has no other name, and the track was still damp, and their breath made small clouds in the cold air. "How are you?" Kiba said. Not as a greeting. As a genuine inquiry. "Good. Genuinely good. I believe you." Another lap's worth of silence. I have been thinking about what to say to you for 2 months. What did you settle on? The truth, which took longer to arrive at than it should have. Kiba ran with his characteristic ease, that elegant economy of motion that made him look like he was moving through water. I knew something was wrong before you filed. Not the specifics, but the direction. I said nothing because I told myself I was not certain enough, that I might be misreading the situation. He paused. I was reading it correctly. I simply did not want to have to act on what I was reading. Kiba. I am not looking for absolution, Kiba said, with the directness he always employed when he had decided to be direct. I am looking to say the true thing so that it has been said. What you do with it is entirely yours. Understood. They ran another lap. The work you are doing, Kiba said. The contracts. The development track you and Rossweiss have laid out. I have heard about it through various channels. A pause. It is a different kind of strength than the one we were all trained toward. More complete. Rossweiss would say we are only beginning to understand what complete looks like. Rossweiss is usually right about things that can be measured. The faintest edge of warmth in Kiba's voice when he said her name. She is fortunate to have found a framework where her research can actually develop. Issei glanced at him. There was something in the way Kiba said that which had more layers than the surface indicated, but he did not press it. Kiba would get to what he meant when he was ready. Can I ask you something? Issei said. Of course. What do you want? Not what you are committed to. What you actually want. Kiba ran 3 strides before answering. A place where what I am is used honestly. Where my loyalty is met with equivalent honesty. He paused again. A context where the people around me are there because they chose to be, not because we were all placed in the same configuration by someone else's decision. The words landed with the clarity of something that had been precise before it was spoken. Issei did not say anything for a moment. He ran and thought and let the thought settle. When you are ready to think about what that looks like concretely, he said finally, I am willing to have that conversation. Kiba looked at him. Something in his face moved carefully, like a door that has been tested and found to be on solid hinges. I know, Kiba said. That is why I am here at 5:30 in the morning. They ran until the sky began its serious work of becoming day, and when they separated at the track gate there was no handshake, no formal agreement, just the quiet understanding between 2 people who have said the true things and can now let time do the rest of the work. Issei walked home through the early morning and felt the boosted gear pulse steadily in his chest, the warmth of it, the companionable presence of Drake who said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The pieces were moving. Not by force. By gravity. By the natural motion of things finding the level they belong at. He thought that was probably how it was supposed to work. Chapter 25 The Conversation with Sona. Sona Citri requested a formal meeting 2 weeks after the invitational. The venue she proposed was neutral, a small private room at the Underworld's administrative building, the kind of space that existed for exactly this purpose. Conversations that were not yet official but were more than casual, conducted between parties who were both operating in good faith, and wanted the record to reflect that. He arrived 5 minutes early. She was already there, which he had expected. The room had 2 chairs and a low table and very good lighting. He sat. She sat. A staff member brought tea without being asked, which suggested someone had briefed them on Sona's preferences. She poured for both of them, which he noted was an act of equivalence, the host role distributed rather than claimed. Thank you for coming, she said. Thank you for the invitational access. It was useful. I thought it would be. She held her cup. I will be direct. You have always responded better to directness than to diplomatic architecture. I have, he agreed. You are building something. The outline of it is visible to anyone paying attention, and several people are paying attention. What you have built so far is a core of personal loyalty, a development track that is genuinely innovative, and a contractor reputation that has moved faster than your experience level would normally predict. She looked at him steadily. You are going to need a formal structure eventually. Independent contractor status is a transitional position, not a destination. I know. I am not here to recruit you into my peerage, she said, clearly and immediately. What I am here to propose is a different kind of relationship. A formal alliance between your developing faction and mine. Mutual support on specific operations. Information sharing within agreed parameters. Political backing in the tribunal when relevant. She paused. In exchange for the same from your side, as your faction develops the capacity. He looked at her. At the precise steadiness of her gaze, the complete absence of manipulation in it. Sona Citri negotiated the way she did everything else, with the clarity of someone who had thought through all the implications and was presenting the honest version rather than the optimized one. Why? He asked. Because the underworld needs more factions built on actual principle rather than inherited position. Because your approach to contracts has demonstrated something that formal political structures consistently fail to demonstrate, which is that treating people as ends rather than means produces better outcomes. She set down her cup. And because I believe you are going to be significant regardless of whether I am involved, and I prefer to be in the conversation than observing it. That last reason is very honest. I find that honesty is more efficient than its alternatives. The closest she got to a dry smile. There is also a personal element. I have watched you operate for 3 years. I would like to work with you rather than alongside you. He thought about what she was offering. Not membership. Not a hierarchy with him below her. A lateral relationship between developing entities, formalized enough to have real weight, flexible enough to let both sides continue their independent directions. I need to discuss this with the people involved in what I'm building, he said. Of course. I will give you an answer within 2 weeks. That is entirely reasonable. He looked at her. One condition, regardless of what the answer is. Speak it. Any formal structure we agree to is built on transparent terms. Not strategically phrased terms. Not terms that contain implications that weren't announced. The actual terms, stated plainly, agreed to explicitly. He held her gaze. I am done with arrangements where the real conditions were never disclosed. The room was very quiet for a moment. Something moved in Sona's expression. Not offense. Something more like the look of someone who has just been given exactly the principle they hoped the other party would bring. That, she said, is not a condition. That is simply how it should work. She extended her hand across the table. Not a contract. A commitment to the conversation. Agreed. He shook it. Outside the administrative building, the underworld did its usual work of suggesting a sky, and Issei walked through it thinking about transparency and terms and the specific gravity of choosing something with your eyes fully open. He had a meeting to call. He had people to talk to. He had, he thought, the beginning of something real.